Hey friends, this evening we're starting with a question that's haunting millions today. How does an honest working person ever afford a home without drowning in debt or giving up half their life in rent? These days, you hear the same story in every corner of the country. A young couple saves for years, only to be outbid by a hedge fund. A retired vet on a fixed income watches property taxes outpace his pension. Even middle-class workers, teachers, mechanics, nurses wonder if homeownership has become a fairy tale. And yet, there was a time not so long ago when owning a modest home was the norm, not the exception. Not because people were rich, but because people were intentional. That's where tonight's story comes in. It's about a boy from the Rust Belt, born into a noisy, smoky neighborhood where houses leaned a little and walls talked back in the winter. And how, by the age of 23, with nothing but a dented lunchbox and a hand-kept ledger, he bought his first house. Cash. No lottery, no inheritance, no six-figure salary. Just work, routine, and a way of thinking that seems almost extinct now. That boy, as you've guessed, was me, Eddie Miller. This was long before Miller Tech engines or any fancy titles. I still had grease under my fingernails and called sliced bologna a Friday dinner. And the house? It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, sagging porch, wallpaper from the Eisenhower era. But it was mine. And getting there step by step, bite by bite, taught me more about money than any seminar or spreadsheet ever could. So tonight, before we tuck in and let the world fade a bit, I want to take you back to 1968, back to the mills, back to the handwritten numbers in my pocketbook, back to the man who told me, if you know where every penny goes, boy, you'll never be poor in your mind. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this kind of gentle content. Tell me where you're watching from and what's the weather like in your corner of the world this evening. Now, take a deep breath, sip your coffee or tea, and let's ease into this evening's story together. I was 18 the first time I held a real paycheck. Not a cash-under-the-table job or a neighbor's tip, but a proper, taxed, union-stamped slip from Pittsburgh Works, the steel mill off Carson Street. I still remember the smell in that place. Hot iron, oil, sweat, and something like scorched toast. They put me on cleanup first, sweeping grit under blast furnaces, changing filters the size of bathtubs, and dodging language that would melt your ears if you weren't used to shift life. It wasn't glamorous, but to me it was gold. See, I didn't come from a house with money. We had duct-taped boots, canned beans, and exactly one phone, a rotary nailed to the wall with a frayed cord. But what we lacked in wealth, we made up for in discipline. And that discipline showed up in 2 places, my dented steel lunchbox and a small, cloth-bound ledger I kept folded in my back pocket. The lunchbox carried the same meal almost every day, 2 peanut butter sandwiches, an apple, and a thermos of weak coffee. Sometimes a boiled egg if Ma had extra. I called it the mortgage meal, because every dollar I didn't spend on lunch I logged in the ledger as a house payment. Not a payment yet, of course, just a line. Lunch skipped, 45 cents saved. Walked home, 15 cents saved. No soda, 10 cents saved. They seem like tiny numbers now, but I learned early, tiny numbers stacked daily will outbuild any windfall. By my 19th birthday, I had saved $462, nearly 1 full month's wage. I didn't tell anyone, not because I was ashamed, but because back then bragging about money was seen as tacky. You showed what you had by how steady you walked, not by how loud you talked. Every evening after my shift, I'd come home and open the ledger. Add the day's savings, list the temptations I dodged, didn't buy new work boots, patched old ones instead. Didn't go to movies with boys, saved $1.10 passed on jukebox nickel, didn't need Elvis today. I wasn't miserable. In fact, I found peace in it. There's a kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you're building something, even if no one else sees it yet. That ledger became more than a record. It was a compass. A quiet partner reminding me, you're not poor, son, you're planning. And every Sunday, I'd meet with an old millworker named Hank McCall. He was one of the few men I knew who owned his home outright. No mortgage, no bank. Just a deed with his name on it and a front porch he painted every June like clockwork. We'd sit on his steps and sip instant coffee, and I'd ask him about money. One afternoon, he leaned in and said something I never forgot. Money ain't the answer. But knowing where your money sleeps each night, that'll let a man rest. At the time, I didn't fully get it, but oh, I would. Because by age 20, I was on track to buy a house, not with credit, but with intention. And just when I thought I had it all figured out, life, as it tends to do, threw me a curve, a layoff, a busted furnace, and the hardest financial lesson I'd ever face. It was January of 1970 when the mill shut down for maintenance. That's what they called it, but everyone on the floor knew what it really meant. They were cutting hours, and the youngest guys like me were first to go. I walked out that day with two things in my pocket, a final paycheck and my ledger. The wind on Carson Street bit harder that afternoon. Now, you might think this was the part of the story where I got desperate. But here's the thing, because of that little cloth-bound ledger, I wasn't afraid. I didn't have a safety net. I was the safety net. I knew exactly how long I could live off what I'd saved. I knew which bills I could stretch. I even knew which local stores still accepted IOUs, though I hoped I'd never need to write one. Still, something changed that week. When you go from daily routine, boots, whistle, steam, to sitting at your mother's kitchen table watching the kettle boil, you start to think. And I thought a lot about Hank's words. Know where your money sleeps. So I did something I'd never done before. I walked to the credit union on 5th Avenue, wore my best shirt, the one without the grease on the cuffs, and asked to speak to someone about real estate. Not a loan, not a mortgage, just information. The man they sent out was short and wiry, with the kind of smile that made you feel both welcome and judged. "Name's Porter," he said. "What can I help you with, son?" I pulled out my ledger, opened to the first page, and laid it flat on the desk. "I want to buy a house," I said. "Not today, but soon, with cash." He blinked. "Do you have family money?" I shook my head. "Just this lunchbox," I said, holding it up, "and these numbers." To his credit, Porter didn't laugh. He flipped through the pages slowly, frowning in that serious way older men do when they're more impressed than they want to let on. After a while, he closed the book, looked me in the eye, and said, "There's a place in Arlington Heights. 2-bedroom. Owner passed. Needs work, but they might let it go for $6 grand. $6,000, more than I had, but not impossible." I asked him what kind of repairs. "Roof leaks, furnace is shot, kitchen's from '52. He paused, "But the bones are good." And that's when I felt it, that small tug in the chest. The kind you get when you see something that might become yours. I didn't say yes, didn't rush. But that night, I sat down with Ma at the table. We poured tea, and I said, "Ma, I think I found the house." She didn't ask if it was pretty, didn't ask how big the bedrooms were. She just reached out, took my hand, and whispered, "If it's yours, you'll know what to do next." And the next morning, I packed that same lunchbox, folded my ledger tight, and walked back to Mr. Porter with an offer. But there was one problem I hadn't counted on. Someone else was interested, and they weren't paying in cash. The other bidder was a contractor. You could tell just by the way Porter said his name, Mr. Delaney. Big voice, nice truck. He owned 3 rental properties already and was planning to flip this one or lease it out. "I'm afraid he's offering full price. Porter said, lowering his voice. 6,000, Porter nodded. Bank check, closing in 2 weeks. I felt my throat tighten. It wasn't anger, just that low hum of disappointment when something you almost touch gets pulled away. I thanked him for his time, and I walked out, but I didn't go home. I walked 3 blocks further out toward Arlington Heights, and I stood across the street from that sagging 2-bedroom. It had a porch that dipped slightly in the middle like it was bowing, a rusted mailbox, one broken shutter that hung crooked like a wink, but the roofline was strong, the chimney straight, and beneath all the wear you could still feel a kind of dignity. It's just waiting for someone to love it again, I said out loud. Then I did something odd. I walked to the back of the house where the alley met the yard and looked through the chain-link fence. The yard was overgrown, sure, but there was a lilac bush there, blooming in January. That's when I knew I had to try, so I went back to Porter the next morning with a proposal. I'll match the contractor's price, I said, but not in a bank check, in weekly installments. No loan, no mortgage, just a direct sale. He raised an eyebrow. You want to pay for a house like it's a layaway suit? I shrugged. Every Friday, 6 p.m., I hand you a sealed envelope. You don't cash it until it's all there. Porter leaned back thinking. He made some calls. Took a week. But eventually the owner's niece, who had inherited the property, agreed. She said she preferred it go to a local boy who will live in it, not just paint it beige and jack up the rent. The deal was simple, no keys until final payment. Any missed week voids the agreement. All cash tracked, logged, and signed by both parties. And just like that, my Friday ritual began. Each week, I worked odd jobs, hauling coal, fixing fences, clearing gutters, and came into the credit union at exactly 5:58 p.m. Porter would meet me at the counter. We'd sit in the small, glass-walled room. I'd slide the envelope across the table. He'd nod. I'd log the payment in my ledger. Then I'd walk out back to my mother's house with hands frozen and hope burning warm behind my ribs. 12 weeks in, I was halfway there, and then came the biggest surprise yet. Porter called me in early one Thursday morning. I figured something had gone wrong, but instead he sat me down with an envelope of his own. Inside was a short letter from the seller's niece. You've honored your word. We'd like you to move in early and finish the payments from your new home. I must have stared at that letter for 5 full minutes. Early move-in? I asked. Porter grinned. She said she'd rather have someone sleeping in the place than vandals breaking windows. I nodded. Then I walked outside, found a pay phone, and called my mother. She didn't say anything at first. Then, soft as ever, I'll get the mop bucket ready. And that weekend, with no moving van, no ceremony, just a cardboard box and a prayer, I stepped into my first house. But what happened next? That's where the real work began. The first night in the house, I didn't have a bed, just a borrowed cot from my uncle and an itchy wool blanket. No heat either, the furnace was still out, and it'd be another week before I could afford a repairman. But I remember lying there under layers of clothes, staring at the cracked ceiling and feeling rich. Not in money, not yet, but in possibility. The air smelled like old wallpaper and damp wood, but it was mine. Every creak in the floorboard belonged to me. Every scuff on the wall was a blank canvas, not a landlord's warning. The next morning, I started what would become my weekend ritual for the next 9 months, fixing one thing, just one, every Saturday and Sunday. I made a list, same way I tracked my money. Only this one was taped to the fridge. Fix list week 1, patch hole in hallway wall, clean gutter, strip wallpaper in kitchen, check fuse box, don't get electrocuted. The work was slow, ugly sometimes, but it taught me something that no job or school ever had. Ownership isn't a moment, it's a mindset. Every time I patched a crack or oiled a hinge, I wasn't just fixing a house. I was building respect for the space, for myself, for the dollar it took to buy each can of paint. One afternoon, I found an old rocking chair at a church rummage sale, paid $2.50 for it, carried it home on my back like a turtle shell. I set it near the front window facing the street, didn't even have curtains yet. But that chair, that was the first place I sat and thought, so this is what it feels like to come home. A few of the neighbors took notice. Mr. DeFalco, across the street, a widower with a Boston Terrier and the loudest lawnmower I'd ever heard, came over with a bag of tools and said, "You put in the work, kid. Time for better caulking." He helped me seal the windows that week. Then came Mrs. Beatrice from next door, brought over a loaf of banana bread and a box of mismatched curtains. "I raised 3 boys in this house before it got sold," she said, tapping my porch column. Glad to see someone steady moved in. Bit by bit, the house stopped looking abandoned. The porch was painted, the mailbox replaced, a new number plate over the door, 1241, stenciled by hand. It was far from finished, but it was functional, and most of all, it was mine. The final payment came in August. I'd been ahead by a week thanks to an overtime haul moving gravel. Porter called me in, handed me the deed in a manila envelope, and said something I didn't expect. "You did it the hard way, but you did it right." No confetti, no parade, just a piece of paper and a handshake. I walked out that day into the sun, squinting like a man who hadn't blinked in months. And I thought, what now? Because once you reach a goal you've chased for years, there's a moment of stillness. But not for long, because the house, it was just the beginning. What I learned inside those walls would shape every business, every dollar, every decision I made from that point forward. And it all began with a lunchbox and a ledger. After the deed was signed, something strange happened. I didn't feel finished. I felt restless. The kind of restless that doesn't come from ambition, but from clarity. Because once I owned the house, truly owned it, I realized I hadn't just bought 4 walls. I'd bought freedom. No landlord, no lease, no monthly payments hovering over my head like a cloud with a due date, just space and silence. And the question, what can I build now? I took a week off from all repairs, just sat with my thoughts. And one afternoon, sitting in that same rocking chair with the sun warming the windowsill, I flipped back through my ledger. I noticed something I hadn't before. Nearly every side job I took, yard work, tool repairs, furniture hauling, came from neighbors. Word of mouth, trust, reputation. I hadn't just built a house fund. I'd accidentally built a network, and something clicked. What if I turned that steady flow of odd jobs into something intentional? That night, I opened a new page in the ledger and wrote, "House paid time to multiply." The next morning, I walked to the hardware store and spent $6 on poster board, black markers, and thumbtacks. By lunchtime, I had flyers posted on 4 telephone poles and a laundromat bulletin board. Eddie Miller, reliable handyman. Fair rates, local, honest. No job too small. Simple. Within 2 days, I had 5 calls, and just like that, housework for Eddie began. It started with gutter cleanings, leaky faucets, patching drywall. But I kept notes, customer names, what I fixed, what I charged. And every Friday, just like with the house payments, I slid 50% of my earnings into a small green metal box I kept under the floorboard in my closet. This time, it wasn't for a house, it was for opportunity. Now let me tell you a little secret about that time in my life. I didn't always want to be in business. I didn't dream of a company or a name on a truck. I just wanted to not worry. To walk into a grocery store and buy 2 kinds of cereal if I wanted. To say yes when Ma asked for new curtains without checking my wallet twice. But the more I worked, the more I saw something that made me pause. Most folks weren't short on effort, they were short on structure. No plan, no system, no ledger, just money in, money out, and then wondering where it all went. So I started offering something new in my service: budget coaching free with any repair. It wasn't fancy. Just me sitting at a kitchen table after fixing a leaky pipe, asking, "Mind if I show you how I tracked my house fund?" Some rolled their eyes, but most listened, and one woman, widowed, raising her grandson, said it best. "No one's ever told me I could plan like that. They just assumed I'd always be behind." That stuck with me because owning a house hadn't changed who I was, but it had changed what I could offer others. Not just services, but steadiness. And in the Rust Belt of the 1970s, steadiness was rare, valuable, and contagious. By the fall of 1971, housework for Eddie had become more than weekend jobs. It was a full-time rhythm. I had a binder now, not just a ledger with tabs for repairs, expenses, customer referrals. And I started to notice something I didn't expect. People weren't hiring me just because I was cheap. They were hiring me because I showed up on time, because I remembered their names, because I kept promises. One old man, a retired pipefitter with missing teeth and a handshake like a vice, told me flat out, "You fix sinks, sure, but what you really fix is people's belief that young men still give a damn." And I carried that with me. By December, I had saved enough to fix the furnace in my house properly. Not a patch job, a real system, new ducts, updated thermostat, the works. It cost $900, and it was worth every cent. Because that winter, Ma moved in. Her health was slipping a little. The old apartment upstairs had stairs too steep, and the radiators hissed more than they heated. So I made up the guest room, baked her cornbread, and said, "No rent, just stories." She laughed, but she never stopped cleaning. That woman could scrub a floor like it owed her money. We settled into a rhythm. I worked jobs. She kept the kettle full. And every night, we sat by the radio and listened to the world turning, oil crises, layoffs, political scandals, but from a place that felt steady. And one night, she said something that made me stop mid-spoonful of stew. "You know, Eddie, you could teach this. What you did with the house, with your book." I shrugged. "I'm no teacher, Ma." She gave me a look, that look every mother reserves for when you're being modest past the point of sense. "You are, son. You just use a hammer instead of chalk." So I thought about it. And in the spring of 1972, I did something I never imagined. I taught my first workshop. The community center let me use a back room with folding chairs and one chalkboard. I put up signs at the church, grocery store, and VFW hall. The topic: how to track a dollar like a dog on a hunt. 9 people showed up, mostly seniors. One young couple. I told my story. Showed them my original ledger, still smudged with coffee stains and grit. Walked them through the system, daily entries. Zero waste. Every dollar assigned a purpose. I didn't charge a dime, but when it ended, 3 people asked if I could help them set up their own. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with Ma sipping tea beside me, I realized something beautiful. The house I bought, it wasn't just shelter. It was proof. Proof that with a lunchbox, a ledger, and a plan you could carve out something solid in a world that often felt like quicksand. And now I could pass that proof on, one neighbor at a time, one note in a ledger, one steady story in a noisy world. By the time 1973 rolled around, I'd taught 5 workshops. Not because I set out to be some kind of financial guru, Lord knows I wasn't. I still patched my own socks and bought day-old bread from the bakery on Main. But the room kept filling up. People brought their brothers, their cousins, their grown kids home from college. The questions weren't fancy. Where do I start? What do I cut? How do I save when everything costs more than it used to? And to each one I said the same thing: start with where your dollars sleep. Know their names, know their jobs, and don't let a single one get lazy. It wasn't Wall Street talk, it was lunchbox logic. I even printed out little cards to give away: the three-legged stool of money, earn, track, wait, underneath, in small letters. And when in doubt, patch your boots before buying new ones. The funny thing is that little house, the sagging two-bedroom in Arlington Heights, it became more than shelter. It became a classroom, a sanctuary, a place where stories were shared and plans were made. I had neighbors dropping by just to talk numbers, show me their ledgers, ask for advice. We weren't rich, not one of us, but we were steady. And that steadiness spread like warmth in winter. Looking back, I know the house was never the real prize. What I really bought with that lunchbox and ledger was confidence, clarity, a community of people learning to trust themselves again. And now, all these years later, sitting here on my porch in Vermont with a thermos in hand and grandkids running through the yard, I still keep that first ledger in my desk. Not because I need it, but because it reminds me who I was and what's still possible. You see, owning a house is a dream, but knowing how to earn it, that's the legacy. That's the quiet inheritance we can still pass on, not through trusts or wills, but through habits, through rhythm, through stories like this one. So tonight, if you're listening from an apartment that creaks or a rented room that doesn't quite feel like yours, I hope this story gave you something more than nostalgia. I hope it gave you a map, because the world's louder now, faster, less forgiving. But some truths don't age, and the one I carry with me: if you treat every dollar like a seed, and your patience like water, something solid will grow. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this kind of gentle content. Tell me where you're watching from and what's the weather like in your corner of the world this evening. Now rest easy. Let the house quiet down. And know, even in uncertain times, discipline is still the doorway to dignity. Have a peaceful night ahead.